Imagine this for a moment. You are born thousands of years ago, not in a modern hospital, not in a home with clean water, electricity, or antibiotics, but in the sands of ancient Egypt. The Nile River flows nearby, temples tower over villages, and the pharaoh rules as a living god. But for you, a tiny newborn in this world, your survival is anything but guaranteed. Life in ancient Egypt was full of rituals, mysteries, and awe-inspiring monuments, but it was also harsh, fragile, and uncertain, especially if you were a baby. So what were your chances of survival as an infant in ancient Egypt? To answer that, we need to travel back to a civilization that flourished for over 3,000 years, a society where medicine, religion, and environment collided in ways that could either protect a newborn or seal their fate. Today, we'll peel back the layers of history and examine childbirth, infant care, nutrition, disease, cultural practices, and the many challenges that determined whether an Egyptian baby would live long enough to take their first steps, let alone grow into adulthood. Let's start with childbirth itself. Giving birth in ancient Egypt was not the medically managed event we know today. There were no sterile operating rooms, no epidurals, and certainly no trained obstetricians. Instead, women were assisted by midwives, experienced older women from the community who passed down knowledge from generation to generation. Birthing often took place in the home, sometimes in a special room or on birthing bricks, clay blocks that women squatted on during delivery. These bricks were decorated with protective symbols and images of gods like Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, or Bes, the dwarf god who frightened away evil spirits. Their presence was thought to shield mother and child from harm, but despite these rituals, the act of childbirth was extremely dangerous. Complications like prolonged labor, breech births, or hemorrhaging could easily lead to death for both mother and child. Without surgical interventions, a difficult delivery was often fatal. Historians and archaeologists estimate that infant mortality in ancient Egypt was shockingly high. Possibly as many as 1 in 3 babies never made it past infancy. Imagine that, a third of all babies born may not have survived, and in some communities, that number could have been even higher. Now let's consider what happened if you were fortunate enough to be born alive and survive those first critical hours. Immediately, protection rituals began. Amulets were tied around babies to ward off evil spirits. Mothers might recite spells from magical papyri to protect their child from disease and demons. Milk from the mother was seen not just as food, but as sacred nourishment, carrying the essence of life. If the mother could not nurse, sometimes a wet nurse was brought in, but this was typically available only to wealthier families. Nutrition played a critical role in survival. Breastfeeding was the main source of sustenance for infants, often continuing for 2 to 3 years, which also helped space pregnancies. This was vital in a world where access to clean water was limited, and cow or goat's milk carried a high risk of contamination. Malnutrition, however, was still a threat. In times when the Nile's flooding was poor, food shortages spread through Egypt. If the mother was undernourished, her baby would also suffer. Disease was another constant danger. Ancient Egypt's warm climate and the Nile's fertile floodplains were perfect for farming, but they also bred parasites and infections. Waterborne diseases like schistosomiasis, a parasite still found in Egypt today, could affect children from a very young age. Diarrheal diseases were especially deadly for infants, as dehydration quickly became life-threatening. Without modern rehydration solutions, infections of the lungs, skin, and eyes were also widespread. Archaeologists studying mummified remains of children have found evidence of malnutrition, anemia, and chronic infections, clear signs of how fragile early life was. And then there were accidents. Imagine growing up in a world without vaccines, without helmets, without safety nets. Even small wounds could become infected, and burns, falls, or animal bites could be fatal. Protection from the gods was sought through charms, but physical dangers were everywhere. Yet despite these challenges, ancient Egyptians loved children deeply. Families were central to society, and babies were seen as blessings from the gods. Artwork often shows parents holding children tenderly, and letters and texts reveal the grief parents felt when children were lost. Even names sometimes reflected hopes for survival. Babies might be given names invoking gods to secure divine protection. For example, a child might be named Ptah Hotep, meaning Ptah is satisfied, as a way of asking the god Ptah for blessing and health. Interestingly, children were not considered fully integrated into society until after they survived their first few years. This reflects the harsh reality that so many babies died young. Archaeological evidence shows high numbers of infant burials, sometimes in jars placed under homes or near family tombs. These burials were both practical and symbolic. Practical, because infants were buried close to their families. Symbolic, because it kept the spirit of the child near. Let's zoom out and look at survival chances statistically. Modern historians and anthropologists suggest that life expectancy at birth in ancient Egypt was shockingly low, perhaps around 30 to 35 years. But that doesn't mean people dropped dead at 30. Rather, this average was dragged down dramatically by infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, your odds of living into your 50s or 60s increased substantially. In other words, the first few years of life were the deadliest. Survival as a baby was almost like passing through a dangerous gate. If you made it through, you could hope for a longer life. Religion and magic were constant companions in this struggle for survival. Amulets shaped like scarabs, ankhs, or the Eye of Horus were tied to infants for protection. Spells were inscribed on papyri, asking gods to keep away fevers and demons. Mothers called upon Hathor, goddess of motherhood, and Taweret, goddess of fertility, for protection. This intertwining of faith and health shows how deeply survival was connected to the divine. Without modern medicine, belief and ritual were as important as herbs and ointments. Speaking of medicine, what remedies were available for sick infants? The Egyptians were surprisingly advanced for their time. Medical papyri like the Ebers Papyrus and the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus contained recipes for treating childhood ailments. Honey, for instance, was used as an antiseptic. Herbs like fenugreek and garlic were used for digestive issues, but many treatments also combined superstition and magic. A poultice might be applied along with a spoken incantation, blending the physical and the spiritual. Now let's think about social class. If you were born into a wealthy family or even into royalty, your chances of survival were slightly better. Elite families had access to better nutrition, wet nurses, and medical care. Royal children were often surrounded by attendants and protected with elaborate rituals, but even they were not immune. Records show that children of pharaohs also died young. Disease and danger spared no one. For poorer families, survival was even more precarious. Access to food and care depended heavily on the success of the Nile's flood, and one bad year could spell disaster for an entire village. We also can't ignore the role of environment. The Nile was both a giver of life and a source of danger. Its waters irrigated crops and provided fish, but they also carried parasites and fostered mosquito-borne illnesses. Villages near the floodplains faced seasonal challenges, and during droughts or poor floods, famine could devastate entire regions. Babies, being the most vulnerable, often bore the brunt of these environmental stresses. Despite all of this, there's evidence that community support played a role in survival. Midwives, wet nurses, and extended families created networks of care. Neighbors likely stepped in to help feed or protect a child if the mother was ill or unavailable. This sense of communal responsibility may have improved survival odds, especially in close-knit villages. So if you were a baby in ancient Egypt, your survival chances were slim compared to today. Perhaps only 60 to 70% of infants made it past their first year, and even fewer survived to age 5. Yet those who did survive often grew into resilient adults who contributed to one of the greatest civilizations in history. Every adult you see in Egyptian art, whether a farmer, priest, or soldier, was someone who beat the odds as a child. Your survival as a baby in ancient Egypt depended on a combination of luck, the health of your mother, the flooding of the Nile, the protection of the gods, and the care of your community. It was a delicate balance, constantly threatened by disease, malnutrition, and accidents. And while we often marvel at the pyramids, temples, and mummies left behind, perhaps the real miracle of ancient Egypt is that so many babies survived at all, allowing the civilization to thrive for millennia. When we look back, we realize that survival was not just about biology, it was about belief, environment, and resilience. Ancient Egyptian babies may not have had the medical advantages we take for granted today, but they were born into a society that did everything it could, through ritual, medicine, and community, to give them a fighting chance. And so, if you were that baby, born on the banks of the Nile, your chances of survival were uncertain, but your life, if you made it, would be filled with stories, gods, and traditions that still capture our imagination today. So what do you think? Would you have survived as a baby in ancient Egypt, or would the odds have been stacked too high? Either way, this journey into the past reminds us of how far humanity has come, and how precious and fragile life has always been. If you enjoyed this exploration of ancient life, make sure to like this video, share it with history lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the past. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story from the ancient world. Until next time, remember, every breath we take today is a gift our ancestors once fought so hard to protect.